All right, so today we are going to talk about the French and Indian War. Now, in the last PowerPoint, there was a video with some video questions about the French and Indian War. There's also a 3-minute history recap on the war on this playlist, so make sure you check those out before you get to these. But if you would prefer to have some written notes, we're going to talk a little bit in detail about the French and Indian War, and most importantly, its consequences and the implications of those consequences leading up to the Revolutionary War. If you take a look, you can see our years 1754 to 1763. We're getting really close to that independence movement. So think about the French and Indian War as consequences of colonialism, but also the precursor to the American Revolution. So if you take a look at this map, you can see the original 13 colonies are highlighted there in sort of a gray-purple. And you can see that that's land that is claimed by England as of the year 1750. What you'll notice, and it might be a surprise, is that in that light orange color, there's a whole lot of territory that was claimed by the French, far more than the English possessed. But think about this, a lot of the land that's highlighted there in orange that belonged to the French is really not super useful at this point in time. It's hard to get access to it. There's only a few points of entry by river. It's a large area to defend. It's a large area to cross. So the French had more land, but the British had more land that they could make a lot of money off of, settle people on, and defend. So the story starts in July 1754. The French and the British are kind of bumping up against each other near the East Coast in what we call the Ohio River Valley. And you can see on the map here where the Ohio River runs sort of through the middle colonies up towards New England. This is a really vital trading area for timber, fur trading, fish, dried fish that was salted would be shipped overseas. So this is all making a lot of money for the British and the French, and they're disputing territory here in this river valley. Now, there was a very important fort, Fort Duquesne, which is now known as the city of Pittsburgh, which if the French were able to establish and defend control over that fort, they would ultimately have control over trade in the entire region, and the British were terrified of that potentially happening. Now, this is actually the first time that we hear from George Washington here in this course. George Washington is a young man, he's a young soldier, and he's leading the Virginia militia. So the British tell them that they need to head up to Fort Duquesne and destroy it before the French can take it over. And on July 3rd, 1754, the French retaliate or fight back. So once the war begins after July 3rd, there's two sides, but each side is made up of multiple parties. So you have British soldiers, and they are assisted by the colonial militias. Keep in mind, colonists living in today's United States did not think of themselves as Americans. They were British people living outside of Great Britain. So it's British soldiers, they're British colonists, and a few small Native American tribes that were on their side versus French soldiers and their very powerful allies, the Algonquin Native American Indians. Now, these tribes, this is not one singular tribe. The Algonquin Nation encompasses several other smaller tribes. So they have a huge geographic advantage. They know the area, they know the landscape, and that is an absolute asset in any military conflict. So you are going to get a map, and it looks like this. If you don't already have a copy of it, shoot me an email and ask for it, or grab one when you are in class. So take some time to complete this map. This is going to help you to answer questions about the French and Indian War. So back where we left off, some outcomes of the war. If you take a look at your map, you can see that ultimately Great Britain retains control of the British colonies. The French are virtually pushed out of North America. You can see there's this green striped area, and it says it's ceded. And what that means is essentially it's sort of like being forfeited. It's about halfway between forfeiting something and giving it up voluntarily. So the French agree at the end of the war to cede that land to Great Britain and allow them to have control over it. However, the British were very nervous about the prospect of their colonists moving into that territory. So you can see that British colonists are living all along the East Coast. Now they do technically have access to all of this land that's in that green striped pattern, but the British are a little bit nervous about the potential of having their colonists spread that far out. There was a lot of distrust between European Brits and British colonists who were living in the modern United States. They were often mocked and made fun of as being essentially like rednecks and hillbillies. They weren't as distinguished, they weren't as educated, they were living this very rough, rugged life in America. So the British did not have a lot of faith in the ability of the colonists to appropriately maintain control over that new land. As a result of that distrust, one of the really significant changes, and this is a term to keep in mind, one of the really significant changes at the end of the French and Indian War is the end of what we call salutary neglect. Essentially, King George III, who was the King of England at the time, had not paid too much attention to the activities of the colonists. They were allowed to have relative independence over self-governance and decisions that were made with the land in the American colonies. However, at the end of the French and Indian War, he begins to take a more active role in really controlling the lifestyle of the colonists here in the U.S. And one of the big changes is that he starts to tax colonists to pay for the expenses of the war. The French and Indian War cost Great Britain a lot of money. Just think about how expensive it would be to deploy an army overseas. They're fighting against the Algonquins, who know the land much better. The British experienced a lot of casualties. They went through a lot of their resources. So now they need to try to make up for the money they've lost in the war, and they increase taxes on the colonists. On the other hand, while King George believed that the colonists needed to be babysat, the American colonists believed that they, in fact, had proven themselves worthy because the British victory in the end of the French and Indian War, they believed was significant because it indicated their capability to defend themselves, to have their own leaders like George Washington take the helm, and they believed they earned more rights and more liberties from Great Britain. Now, the treaty that ends the French and Indian War is the Proclamation of 1763, also known as the Treaty of Paris, also known as the Peace of Paris. And I will warn you, this gets very confusing because there are multiple treaties of Paris in American history, but this is the first very significant one. So look at your map here. You can see a red line, and on that line, that's a boundary area where no one was permitted to settle. So the boundary line runs along the west of the Appalachian Mountains, and even though that land became British-controlled land, colonists were told not to settle west of that line. All right, this brings us to the very end of our discussion on the French and Indian War. Like I said, this is a super quick one. You've already done the video, you've done your video questions, you've done your map. The most important thing to remember is this Treaty of Paris, that there is a dividing line drawn telling colonists where they can and cannot go, and now colonists are being taxed heavily for the cost of the war. So these are a couple of factors that will lead us directly into the American Revolution. Because we are at the end of a unit, that means your note cards are due, and you will have a Unit 1 test on the colonies and the French and Indian War, so be prepared for both of those things.